All right, so we're diving into some untold stories from World War II today. And you've brought us this cemetery in Timisoara, Romania. Russian soldiers buried there. But the ones who died after the war are what's really caught your eye, huh? Let's see if we can figure out what's going on there.
Yeah, right off the bat, what gets me is that we're working with just a piece of something bigger, right? An excerpt. Don't know if it's from a history book, a news story, even somebody's diary. Makes it tough to say how much we can rely on it.
True, true. Good point. We got to keep that in mind as we go.
Definitely.
But let's say, just for now, that Ide is giving us the real deal. What really got you going is that bit about the post-war deaths.
Hmm.
Swords calls it the most interesting part. Why'd that stand out to you?
Well, because it's not what you expect, right? Wartime, sure, people die. But peacetime, even in a place where your army's still hanging around,
Yeah.
that's when you start wondering what happened.
Exactly. Like, what was life actually like for those soldiers that everyday stuff became dangerous? And they say tens of these peacetime deaths compared to hundreds during the fighting.
Yeah.
Is that really weird for an army station somewhere for years? Or do we need to just like zoom out to understand why the author thought it was a big deal?
That's the million-dollar question. Were these deaths all bunched together? Like, did something specific happen? Or are we talking about deaths spread out over, who knows, a decade?
Yeah.
Makes a difference, right? Individually tragic either way, but
Mhm.
statistically, not as strange if it's over a longer period.
Right. So maybe the number itself isn't the key thing here. What about the possible causes they throw out there? Accidents, alcohol. Was that common for soldiers back then, especially occupation forces?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Think about the British Army, way back when they were in India. Tons of records of alcohol-related incidents, heat, boredom, being far from home, all that played a role. Soviet soldiers in Romania could easily be the same deal. Plus, being in the military, even when you're not fighting, there's always risks. Training accidents, construction mishaps, even just a vehicle crash. Suddenly those tens don't seem so out there.
Huh. Hadn't thought about it like that. It really makes you picture what it was like for those guys, stuck there, so far from home. And we know Romania was under Soviet control for years after the war, so
Hmm.
it adds another layer to this whole thing.
For sure. I mean, maybe those tens, those are families back in Russia who never even knew what happened to their sons even after the war ended. That's a loss you don't see on a big memorial, just in the quiet rows of a cemetery far away.
Man, that really hits home. All those individual stories hidden in the details. So what does this all mean for our listener, for anyone trying to understand this part of history?
It's a good reminder that history isn't just the big picture stuff, the battles and the winners. It's about the everyday folks caught up in it all, even after the fighting's done. Whatever went down in Timisoara, it tells us something about what it's like to be the occupied country, the occupier, how messy it all is, even when you think it's over.
Yeah. And even with all its question marks, this source makes us ask those questions. So for our listener, anyone who wants to dig deeper, where would you tell them to look?
Well, local stuff is key, right? Archives in Timisoara itself,
Mm.
cemetery records, maybe old newspapers, that kind of thing. See if there are historical groups in Romania, folks studying World War II, especially the Soviet side of things. And if you can get your hands on military records, those might have a whole different angle. It's like there's a whole puzzle out there, pieces scattered
A
around.
puzzle, yeah. And even if we don't get the whole picture, just looking for the pieces tells us something, doesn't it? Who
Wow.
knows what else is hidden in that cemetery?
All right, so get ready to explore something with us, something most people don't know much about. What's this? Well, kind of a hidden chapter, really. We're talking about the Soviet military presence in Romania, but, and here's the catch, after World War II. Up to 1958, in fact.
Yeah, you'd think things would be over and done with well before 58. Well,
Exact. Most folks assume the story wraps up way earlier, but trust me, stick with us on this one. It gets really interesting.
you're right. It wasn't a clean break after the war, not at all. Romania's wartime experience, well, it was
To
complicated.
say the least, right?
Yeah. See, they were initially allied with Germany,
Right, right.
but then switched sides in 44, joining the Allies.
And then came the Paris Peace Treaty. Supposed to bring everything back to normal, restore order, all that. At least that's what it was supposed to do.
On paper, anyway.
That's the key phrase, isn't it? On paper.
Yeah.
Because, and this is where it gets sneaky, the treaty aimed to get all Allied forces out within 90 days.
Right.
But then there's this clause, Article 21, and it really throws a wrench in the works, especially for Romania.
Yeah, you could say that.
It's like they slipped a get-out-of-jail-free card right into a peace treaty.
That's a good way to put it. While the treaty said, yeah, Soviet troops were needed in Austria to keep things stable, because it was under joint occupation.
Sure.
Article 21, that's what let them stay in Romania way longer than anyone expected.
Okay, so let's break this down because this is super important to understanding how this whole thing unfolded. You've got this treaty, right? Meant to bring peace, but hidden inside is this loophole, and that's what allowed a huge military force to just stay put in Romania for years. We're not talking a small detachment here either.
Oh, no, not at all. We're talking big numbers. The estimates vary, but some sources say there were over 750,000 Soviet soldiers in Romania, maybe even over 1 million at some points.
Wow. Just let that sink in for a sec. 1 million soldiers, that's an occupying force in a country that's just trying to rebuild after a devastating war.
It's massive.
Oh.
Hard to really grasp.
Absolutely. It's one thing to read a sentence about it in a history book, but to picture it,
It's different, yeah.
hundreds of thousands of soldiers from a foreign power
Yeah.
just there in
Yeah.
your country
Yeah.
every single day, impacting everything. And this is over a decade after the war was supposedly over. That leaves a mark.
Oh, it does. It really does. And that's where things get really interesting because we're going to get into what it was actually like to live through that time. And we're going to use the city of Timisoara as our example.
And this is where those firsthand accounts from our listeners' research are so powerful. It's one thing to talk about troop numbers, but these personal stories, they make it real.
You said it. These accounts, they give us a window into what daily life was like for Romanians during this occupation, what they experienced, how they felt. We'll explore those stories and see how they connect to the bigger picture in Romania. So picture this. You're in Timisoara, trying to rebuild your life, put the war behind you. But then every day you see Soviet tanks just rumbling through the streets.
Or worse, through your fields. Our listeners' research mentions how these tanks would just crush crops, people's livelihoods. Gone just like that.
Exactly. And it wasn't like you could just, call up the local authorities to complain. This wasn't some neighborhood dispute.
No, not at all. This was different.
Very different. And it wasn't just the tanks themselves, right? It's the constant fear.
Yeah.
The stories of women being harassed. And knowing that if you reported any of it,
Mm-hmm.
there could be retaliation.
The sources really paint a picture of that vulnerability. Being trapped, almost. No way to speak out, no way to fight back.
Right. You're spot on. That feeling of being
Yeah.
under their thumb, it was
Well,
everywhere.
like that weight we talked about earlier. But now it's not just an idea, it's a deity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, when we talk about why this period is still. Well, it casts a long shadow, even though most people don't know about it.
Mm.
This is why.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. And while Timisoara gives us this really close-up view of what occupation was like, it's important to remember it wasn't just happening there.
Right.
What we're seeing in these accounts, that
Yeah.
oppression, that injustice, the sources make it clear this was all over Romania.
It was systematic, they controlled information, they silenced anyone who spoke up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine living with that, knowing that expressing your opinion, just saying what you think, could have terrible consequences. It really shows you how deep occupation goes, how it's not just about soldiers being physically present.
And then finally, 1958, the Soviet troops withdraw.
It's over.
You'd think there'd be this huge sigh of relief across the country, right? A chance to breathe again, to really start moving on.
You'd hope so, wouldn't you?
But then, and this is where it gets, I don't know, almost hard to believe,
What's that?
they held a medal ceremony.
Medal ceremony.
Right before they left. Soviet troops were awarded medals for liberating Romania.
Oh, wow. Talk about adding insult to injury, right?
It's
After all that.
bizarre, isn't it? Makes you wonder,
Well,
what was the point of that? Was it supposed to be some kind of peace offering? Or was it just one last show of force?
It's really hard to say for sure. And the context here is important, too. See, by this point, the Soviet Union had been pulling troops out of some other Eastern European countries. After Stalin died, things shifted a bit.
But there's always a but.
Well, most of those countries, they still had permanent Soviet bases, It solidified their place in the Warsaw Pact.
And just so everyone listening is on the same page, the Warsaw Pact, that was essentially the Soviet Union's counterpart to NATO, a military alliance made up of Soviet satellite states, mostly in Eastern Europe, all happening during the Cold War.
Right, exactly. And this is where Romania's story takes another interesting turn. Because even though they'd been occupied for years, that withdrawal in '58, it meant something really significant. Unlike the other Warsaw Pact countries, Romania, they didn't have any permanent Soviet bases after that.
So much to unpack there. You've got the departure, the medals, this unique situation within the Warsaw Pact. It's almost like, I don't know, trying to put a nice, neat ending on something that was anything but neat.
Yeah, it's messy, that's for sure.
Mm.
And it makes you think, about how all of this shaped Romania's identity.
Mm.
Like, did this back and forth with the Soviets, this push and pull for so long,
Yeah,
did it in some way lead to Romania taking a more independent stance later on?
it's an interesting thought, isn't it? We tend to think of history in these big, sweeping movements. Wars, treaties, alliances. But then you zoom in on a period like this and you see how all of that played out in people's lives, in
Hmm.
their homes, their streets. Years of occupation, that uncertainty hanging over everything, and then that medal ceremony at the very end.
Hmm.
Those aren't things you just forget.
No, you don't. And it makes you wonder about the psychological impact of it all, especially that ceremony. Like, did it feel like one final insult, a reminder of everything they'd been through?
Yeah.
Or was there some relief that it was finally truly over, regardless of the medals?
It's easy to get caught up in the political stuff, the military strategy, but at the heart of it are the human stories, right? The people of Timisoara and all over Romania who lived through this. I keep coming back to that question, what would it have felt like to be a Romanian citizen in 1958 watching those troops leave?
Really makes you think, would you feel lighter, like a weight had been lifted,
Yeah.
hopeful for the future?
Right.
Or would there be this lingering worry, like,
Oh,
okay, they're gone, but what's next? After all those years under their control.
and those medals, would you see them as a genuine gesture or just another way of exerting control? It's
Well, it just shows how complex history really is and
yeah.
how it echoes, Even though this particular chapter closed in 1958, it's clear that it had a lasting impact on Romania's path.
It reminds us that history isn't just dates and names on a page. It's about real people, the choices they made, and how those choices still affect us today. And sometimes it's those less explored parts of history that make us think the hardest, that challenge us to really examine the past. It's a good reminder for all of us, really, to look beyond the headlines, beyond the simple narratives, and think about the human side of these events, the individual journeys. Because it's in those stories, those personal experiences, that we can really understand just how profound and how lasting the impact of the past can be. And with that, we'll leave you with a final thought. What stories from your own family's past, stories that might not be in any textbook, has shaped the way you see the world today?